Hello and welcome to The Antidote, where we're turning the tables on your media landscape. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Rothkushel.
Well, this week we're going to be talking about the brand new National Security Advisor, John Bolton, and not so much John Bolton himself, but more or less some of the entities and the interests that he represents and that appear will be represented and whose policy positions will be advocated for and represented in under his management of the National Security Agency. And I think there'd be a lot of overlap in how Bolton approaches certain matters and perhaps how Mike Pompeo approaches certain matters. But one of the things I think we're learning, Jeremy, in analyzing and picking up on some of the reports that are coming out about John Bolton, what some people are saying about him, and his, as well as his history in the foreign policy community and the interest he represents, organizations such as the Gatestone Institute and the Nina Rosenwald and her family, and also the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, or JINSA, and its close relationship with with Frank Gaffney's Center for Security Policy, which is probably, I would say, Gaffney's among Bolton's probably closest, I guess, pure ideological allies within the quote unquote national security community. And it's much more complicated and it's much more sophisticated with someone like a John Bolton, his interests, what he advocates for, what he represents, than I think a lot of people in both the mainstream and alternative media are presenting it. Of course, you've got the Alex Jones wing, which, you've got Alex Jones going on record saying that he's not worried about Bolton because he trusts Donald Trump. He's got Roger Stone and Jerome Corsi there to say that Bolton is a great appointment. And then you've got some of these alt-right types who are just portraying Bolton as a typical neocon. He's going to take us to wars for Israel. Then you've got the left community. The liberal establishment is portraying Bolton as a madman with his finger on a trigger, and that he's a stereotypical, I guess, madman walrus type, that he's just going to just be trigger happy and just want to bomb people and go to war everywhere. And I don't think any of those are quite true. Honestly, I think the closest you're going to get to the truth is from people like Bill Kristol, who in a Weekly Standard podcast said that Bolton's really not a neocon in the sense of what someone like myself represents, referring to Kristol, referring to himself. He's not a nation builder. He's not a democracy promoter. He's a guy who's strictly out for quote unquote the national interest. He's a national security guy. He's interested in what's going to, I guess, in Kristol's words, advance America, an interest. And we can argue whether or not someone like a John Bolton actually advances American interest with his agenda. I would actually probably venture to guess, I would probably say that he really doesn't, as far as what's actually best for America, so to speak, for the American people. But that's how he's presented. But I think it's very important that it's not so clear that John Bolton, someone like a John Bolton, is actually going to advocate taking America to an actual major military conflict as far as an actual physical Iraq-style war with the foreign entity. But I still think that, obviously Bolton's very hawkish. I think there's been a new term that's kind of come up for someone like a Bolton. He's not a neocon. He's a Republican hawk. He's a national security hawk. That's been repeated by someone like Frank Gaffney as well, who supported the Iraq War along with Bolton, but wants to make it very clear that they're not about democracy. They're about national security and security interest. And Iraq was a threat to our security, according to them. Iran is a threat to our security, according to them. It's not about bringing democracy to these nations. It's about protecting what they perceive to be our interests. And I think that's a very significant shift, and I think that explains a lot of the differences within the foreign policy establishment with regards to Donald Trump and so much of the neocon establishment coming out against Trump. And but Bolton, in this interview we found with the Hoover Institute, laid out that he didn't like how the Bush administration started talking about nation building and democracy. They should have stuck strictly to the threat that that someone like Bolton says Saddam Hussein posed with his weapons program, whatever, but he didn't like the emphasis on nation building and democracy. And I think this says a lot about John Bolton. I think when we start to talk about some of the institutions and entities that Bolton has represented, some of the circles that he's been prominent in over the years, I think we're going to get a somewhat of a broader picture of what a John Bolton may actually represent that I don't think is quite accurately represented by the way the media and certain factions within the foreign policy establishment are representing Bolton. So it's very interesting. It's also much more complicated than I think most people would would realize with the figure like a Bolton and the entities behind him and surrounding him.
It's interesting because it is complicated, and at the same time, listening back on that Hoover Institute interview that you sent me of Bolton, probably like a decade ago, talking
Yeah.
about the Iraq War and his little bits of disagreement with the Bush administration, it actually turns out that there's actually almost zero actual foreign policy difference in terms of what someone like Bolton actually is advocating versus the what we can call the paleo neocons, or the sort of well recognized neocons such as the Crystals and the Kagans. And it really, a lot of it just turns on this very specific idea, which I do think it does speak to some of the political, philosophical differences in terms of the Straussian neocons, the sort of strictly Straussian neocons, and they have this old school Platonic philosophy of the so-called philosopher kings, and that there is it's sort of organized like a Judeo-Masonic cell in some way, in terms of the princes of policy know the real truth, and then there's another truth that's given out for the profane public in many ways. And so that's really where Bolton has the beef with these neocons, these paleo neocons, and then ultimately where the Bush administration went in terms of their public relations output around the Iraq War, after they apparently came up empty with the weapons of mass destruction that was the intelligence that was manufactured through these key sort of attached cells on the side of the Pentagon right in the wake of September 11th. And those, of course, are the Office of Special Plans. Abram Shulsky was the director and was answering to people like Douglas Feith and I believe William Luty, but then also the Office of Strategic Influence, which was also set up in the wake of September 11th, actually set up before the Office of Special Plans. It was set up in October 2001, the OSI was. And at some point, it was headed by a Simon Warden, who was also, I believe, answering to Douglas Feith. So in a certain way, you get back to this difference between Bolton and these paleo neocons, and had absolutely nothing to do with about invading Iraq. That was clearly that everyone involved in this whole scheme was on board about that. But then Bolton fits in much more with the kind of rhetoric that we were hearing from the president, Donald Trump, when he was running as a candidate, and he appeared on the Alex Jones show, where he basically said he thought it was a bad decision in Iraq because we weren't grabbing the oil and the minerals in Afghanistan. But of course, there is grabbing of minerals, and there is some type of grabbing of oil too. So that was a fraudulent proposition in many ways. And of course, Alex Jones never called him on that. And in fact, maybe what I'll do is I'll publish. I did a phone call after that, maybe months after that, calling out Alex for helping Trump not only perpetrate the bin Laden did 9/11 mythos, fake information, as he did on Alex's show, but also the doubling down about his thing about Muslims were celebrating on September 11th. And Alex not only didn't correct that record and say, no, the only people that were actually arrested celebrating on September 11th were Israeli intelligence associated forces in New Jersey, and then also in white vans heading across towards the George Washington Bridge and the Lincoln Tunnel. And we'll get more into how JINSA fits into September 11th. And but then going back to Alex Jones, he doubled down on that by offering up, the Palestinians were also celebrating. And that, of course, was another key piece of propaganda. That was a Freudian slip, I think, because of the potentials of the PP gate coming back up. But
Yeah, yeah. The narrative of the Palestinians celebrating, they were given sweets from Osama bin Laden, I think, is how one of the TV narrators portrayed it. So yeah, that was a big deal, and clearly so.
So so the Bolton is much more direct. He doesn't never wanted the Bush administration and the paleo neocons to dance around with these issues of democracy promotion and the nation
Yeah.
building. And he sees this as just so much fluff, and that it's really about the idea of national security. But of course, when you actually hear him talk about it, he's really talking about the national security of what he calls our allies in the region. And specifically, he says Israel. So when it comes down to it, it's really not United States security. Everybody honest in the U.S. intelligence community at that point knew that there was no actual national security threat from Saddam Hussein's government at that point in time. And this had everything to do with a very specific hard line foreign policy set in Israel that was apparently very much at the core also of the September 11th operation. And then also, as we'll talk about a little bit more, maybe a little bit later, that some of their henchmen and their complicit elements in the United States of America were very much, in terms of both the potential 9/11 operation, but the ongoing cover-up that in many ways is not only centered in D.C. around the Pentagon, but also centered in Manhattan, ties very much into some of these networks that Bolton is deeply a part of, including GINSA.
Yeah, and I think with this, what we're laying out here, it becomes very clear that you had, and for a while, I don't think we were quite able to really for a while when we talked about this neocon split that we've kind of identified, and this may not even be fair to call some of these people neocons. I don't know. Neocon may be a largely weaponized term as it is at this point anyway, but when we were laying out and identifying some of these splits in policy, I don't think we quite really, until now, at least myself, put it together exactly where the split was, and that there really weren't any people in this whole clique. This kind of PNAC clique that comes all the way back to the days of Henry Scoop Jackson and then became a power force in the Reagan administration. There really wasn't a big split on Iraq in general. They all pretty much seemed to be on board with Iraq and with removing Saddam Hussein. If we have to have a war to do it, then so be it. But there are differences in the way it was pitched, and I think that's where a lot of there was some opposition to Bush later on, I think, came from the fact that Bush had kind of sided with the quote unquote democracy builders over the national quote unquote national security people. But basically, I think we've got two factions that were really working closely with the Israeli government and elements within Israeli intelligence to make sure that this war happened, but they have two different ready set, I think largely false narratives in place to kind of justify it. So almost like if you don't get hit by the left hand, well, you're going to get hit by the right hand, and either way we're going to get the same goal put in place. But also I want to say real quick, this isn't really a digression. I think this fits into our overall conversation about what's going on in the age of Trump, is that when you see how Bolton and Gaffney and these Breitbart types are both very close to Breitbart, to the Mercer family, Bolton and Gaffney and their think tanks. When you see their rhetoric on quote unquote national security rather than nation building and democracy, it would make sense as to where they fall on issues such as Brexit and on quote unquote sovereignty in Europe and in the Western world, as opposed to the crystal universalist types who are more in line, I guess, with what you would call the generic kind of neoliberal New World Order kind of agenda, the post-World War II global consensus. So it makes a lot of sense in that regard too, as well, in that why they would come down on the quote-unquote nationalist side when it comes to things like Brexit and trade wars with China, so to speak, as opposed to the crystal types. I think that's a very important distinction as well. I think it sheds a lot of light on that as well.
Yes, and maybe what we'll do is we'll just start getting into some of these networks that are behind this entire so-called foreign policy operation that unites the paleo neocons, the crystals, the epicenter around the Project for a New American Century, which of course John Bolton was an important member of too. but also into some of these more groups that are seen more as nationalist, sort of hardline, hawkish Republicans, as you said, but also fit into this nationalist propaganda or PR manufactured around some aspects of the deep backing of the Trump movement. That includes aspects not only of the CNP, but also then this JINSA and the Gatestone Institute. So maybe we should just wade in a little bit into Gatestone and Nina Rosenwald, because she is a key character that's really not talked a lot about in relationship to the Kagans and Irving Kristol and Leo Strauss, and maybe it's because she's really doesn't seem to be as much of a philosopher type. She doesn't have the philosopher aura, and she's more of a political operative, and with a long-term comes from a family of big funding of Jewish backed initiatives. And so before we get to The World Needs This Man, John's site, who did a very interesting blog post about some of the background behind Trump that includes Nina Rosenwald as a key figure. There is this article in The Nation by Max Blumenthal doing some of his good work as identified. And so I just want to briefly read a few paragraphs of this. It's called The Sugar Mama of Anti-Muslim Hate. Birth of a benefactor. Who is this benefactor of Islamophobia? According to those familiar with Rosenwald, she is anything but a sophisticated Machiavellian operator, quote, a babe in the woods, unquote, as one of her longtime acquaintances described her to me. Rosenwald did not respond to interview requests sent to the Gatestone Institute and her personal email. According to another acquaintance, Rosenwald has a penchant for launching into anti-Arab, anti-Palestinian tirades at public forums, leaping up like, quote, a jack-in-the-box, unquote, to denounce the evildoers. Despite her zealotry, Rosenwald maintains a reputation as a Manhattan socialite who travels in some of New York City's most elite financial and political circles. Her wealthy friends gather for salons at upscale restaurants and in the living room of her Upper West Side apartment to meet major league political personalities, including former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, neoconservative former UN Ambassador John Bolton. I guess an aside, Max considers John Bolton a neoconservative. Back to the article, an associate of the Gatestone Institute, and the late right-wing media provocateur Andrew Breitbart. Next paragraph. Rosenwald counts among her closest friends Norman Podhoretz, the octogenarian neoconservative activist and former Commentary magazine editor, who argues that Jewish Democrats are heretics, betraying their religious duty to support the Jewish state. Rosenwald, according to one friend, is also close to Podhoretz's daughter, Ruthie Bloom, a right-wing columnist who lives in the illegal West Bank settlement of Har Adar and writes a column for Israel Hayom, a newspaper published by far-right billionaire Sheldon Adelson, a chief financial supporter of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Father and daughter echo the line of Likudnik Greater Israel ideology and anti-Muslim fanaticism with Podhoretz, urging the Western world to wage, quote, World War IV, unquote, the title of his post-9/11 polemic against what he and Bloom call, quote, Islamofascism, unquote. Bloom has called for an Israeli war against Iran on the grounds that, quote, Iran is soon to have atomic bombs with which it will attempt to impose Sharia law on the rest of the world after wiping out the Jewish state, unquote. Rosenwald has sustained commentary, now edited by Podhoretz's son John, with regular donations up to $15,000, a modest but important sum for a right-wing Israel-centric magazine with an increasingly minuscule readership. And then there's more on here that goes into the Hudson Institute, which is another key piece of this. But I just want to read one last paragraph here, or two more last paragraphs here, to sort of give some of the historical background Nina Rosenwald's influence is based on the fortune her grandfather Julius earned at the turn of the century as co-owner of Sears, Roebuck and Company. Julius Rosenwald, renowned for his liberal philanthropy, used his fortune to nurture the careers of African-American leaders from Booker T. Washington to W.E.B. Du Bois and writers Langston Hughes and Claude McKay. Like many Reform Jews of his time, Rosenwald kept a cautious distance from Zionism, which organizations like the American Jewish Committee treated as a potential threat to Jewish assimilation in America. And then final paragraph, Julius's son, William, and this is Nina's father, by the way, continued the philanthropic tradition his father inaugurated, with rabbis Abba Hillel Silver and Jonah Wise, two early leaders of the American Zionist movement. William Rosenwald helped form the United Jewish Appeal for refugees and overseas needs to, quote, fortify the Jews of all countries against anti-Semitic onslaughts, unquote. Rosenwald's efforts to resettle imperiled European Jews vaulted him into a lifetime of leadership of major Jewish organizations in the aftermath of the 1967 war, when Israel began its illegal military occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Golan Heights. Rosenwald, like most Jewish institutional leaders, intensified his commitment to the cause of Zionism. Following their father, Nina Rosenwald and her siblings became active in the pro-Israel community, while her sister Elizabeth has assumed a lower profile. There is hardly a single major pro-Israel organization that does not provide Rosenwald with a seat on its board of directors. Thanks to her financial generosity, Rosenwald sits on the board of influential neoconservative groups from WINEP, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, as we're very familiar with Patrick Clausen and Dennis Ross, by the way, and AIPAC, as well as Hudson. She is the vice president of the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, which has provided training to thousands of American law enforcement and military officials, from Israeli intelligence and police officers. So I thought that was some key background to not only her but her family. And although maybe the question, this question of the Rosenwald central relationship to charity in the African American community, I think is a very key one that maybe we should take up at a future time. But it is interesting that Max Blumenthal left out, as far as I can see in this article, that the Rosenwald, originally the Jewish Julius Rosenwald fund, was what ultimately became the Tuskegee experiment. It was passed over to the U.S. government and put in the hands of health officials, and it looks like potentially sort of some type of military physicians of some sort. And everybody knows what the Tuskegee experiment was in terms of, long-term experimentation on African American men and depriving them of solutions to their problem, and actually giving it to them in the beginning, I believe. And I don't know the whole history there, but I think it should be investigated, especially since the Nina Rosenwald's father, William Rosenwald, who was key to the United Jewish Appeal, which we'll look into a little bit next, was on the board of the Tuskegee Institute over, I believe, at least some of the decades where this was being hidden, in terms of that there was human experimentation using African American men as the guinea pigs over decades. So there's something there that should be dug into, and maybe we'll look into that in the future, because I just, this whole idea of charity, and we're familiar somewhat of this sort of, at the very least, sort of patronizing or managing relationship between Jewish money and power and the Black community, and specifically some of the prominent figures and activists and institutions in general. And just the last thing in terms of that history, I did see an article where sort of there was praise for the Rosenwald tradition of charity for the Black community and showing like a group of young Black school children. I think they were all girls. And in fact, that's where Julius Rosenwald, I think, got his start, is in funding a bunch of Black schools in the South. There was a picture with his name, Rosenwald, one letter on each shirt across, a bunch of young Black girl students with him in the center. So that's a sort of interesting thing. Rosenwald, the Black students, sponsored by Rosenwald. So that's the background there. And this UJA connection, United Jewish Appeal, is key to understanding the core of Jewish power organizations and how they look like they're charity organizations, but they end up being the epicenter of organizing for potential deep state affairs, especially in relationship to Israel. And I don't know if you have a take on this background of Rosenwald before I move on to reading about the UJA.
Not really. I do think, though, with Rosenwald, it is interesting that if Rosenwald was helping to fund these in any part, had any type of role in these experiments taking place at Tuskegee, it would almost kind of be natural, I guess, for his daughter to go from, simply maybe from from making guinea pigs out of Black Americans, and then moving on to making guinea pigs and scapegoats out of Muslims. So I mean, that would kind of be a natural progression in some ways. But we're definitely going to have, if that's true, we're definitely going to have to revisit the this Rosenwald connection there, because it appears once again, there may very well be a lot of Masonic B'nai B'rith roots out of this as well, with people like W.E.B. Du Bois. And it's interesting how Rosenwald was close to both Booker T. Washington and Du Bois, who were seen as enemies, kind of as antagonistic to each other in the early 1900s, and trying to basically become leaders in the African American community. And so it's really interesting. I think this will all be a very fascinating history to look further into with the Rosenwalds and that part of history. So I think we very well may revisit that at some point.
That's some good points there, Greg, because I think you're right that it is sort of telling where Nina Rosenwald has ended up in terms of what is the legacy in relationship to race, apparently, that her family has handed over to her. I guess you could consider that her apparent racism of some sort that is most intensely focused in this day and age on Arabs around the world, Palestinians specifically, Muslims, but usually the darker skinned Muslims is what it seems like. That suggests there, whether she's just sort of reacting to this very sort of anti-racist or non-racist past that is represented by her grandfather starting charities for Black students is not clear, but it is suggestive that they ended up with there's a granddaughter in the mix who her politics are very racialized.
And on that note, I should mention real quick that while Nina Rosenwald, I think, is rightly in many ways denounced as a bigot against Muslims and Arabs, she also has very prominent defenders within I guess in quote the Arab Muslim intellectual community as well, who will go out of their way to say that she's doesn't have these beliefs and that she's a great champion for freedom and all that. So it goes both ways with these as well. So I just wanted to point that out real quick.
Yes, that's a good point. And so then I just want to delve a little bit into this United Jewish Appeal connection, and it's usually sort of overlooked. But of course, who else was, I believe, involved in the United Jewish Appeal intensely was Larry Silverstein and his family. So that's where I want to go. I want to read from Solving 9/11, the original articles, Christopher Bolin's book that sort of takes us through the history of his reporting on September 11th. And it has a lot actually having to do with the ongoing cover-up of September 11th. And since the Rosenwald family was at the core of the creation of this institution, I think it's maybe telling in terms of their current sponsorship of someone like the incoming National Security Advisor Bolton. So, okay, so on page 220, there's an article called "The Zionist Money Behind 9/11," published May 13th, 2008. One of the most peculiar things about investigating 9/11 is that a whole slew of Zionist criminals, a group of people which is evidently involved in the terror attacks in one way or another, is completely ignored by the controlled media. The accepted history of 9/11, based as it is on the controlled media's interpretation of events, completely ignores the evidence that Israelis and high-level Zionists in the United States played key roles in the terror attacks. As George W. Bush travels to Israel to meet with the nuclear-armed terrorists Shimon Peres and Ehud Olmert, I feel compelled to point out a few of the most obvious and basic connections between the Zionist criminal network and the terror attacks of 9/11. And I'm going to skip a couple paragraphs where he talks about Roman history and telling the truth. The United Jewish Appeal and 9/11. I discovered that Ehud Olmert, the current Israeli prime minister, had visited New York City the very day before 9/11. While I have no information about where Olmert was on 9/11, I suspect he was in New York City on the day disaster struck. In the same way, Yitzhak Rabin was in Dallas when JFK was shot, and Bibi Netanyahu was in London on July 7, 2005. These are not merely coincidences. Olmert was the right-wing Likudnik mayor of Jerusalem when he made his secret visit to New York City on September 10, 2001. This is extremely odd, something I pointed out to my readers. The organist, a Zionist terror gang mayor of Jerusalem, New York's sister city, visits on the eve of the worst terror attacks in U.S. history and nobody even notices? How can that be? It needs to be pointed out that Ehud Olmert played a very conspicuous role in New York City in the aftermath of 9/11, promoting Jerusalem as the sister city fighting terrorism and all that Zionist nonsense. But nowhere did he ever mention that he had been in New York on the day before terror struck. Why not? Why wouldn't he say something like, quote, "I was here the day before," unquote? Why would Mayor Olmert conceal the very fact of his visit to New York on the day before the terror attacks? Where did he spend the night? Was he with Moshe Talansky? Where was he on the morning of 9/11? Why are none of the reporters at the New York Times or any of that city's fine newspapers running after this story? What is Olmert hiding? Don't they care? The published records show that Olmert spent September 9th, 2001 in Toronto, Canada, helping the Zionist United Jewish Appeal, UJA, celebrate the beginning of their annual fundraising drive. This was reported in Toronto Star. Quote, Olmert spent yesterday in Toronto helping the United Jewish Appeal celebrate the official beginning of its annual fundraising drive, unquote. Source, the name of it is Israeli Mayor Happy After Racism Forum by Morgan Campbell, Toronto Star, September 10th, 2001. I discovered that Olmert went to New York City on September 10th through 11th. This information was contained in a Jerusalem Post article about the purchase of the Likudnik football club Betar. It should be noted that the Likudnik organist Olmert was meeting with senior officials of the United Jewish Appeal in Toronto about 36 hours before New York City was bombed by false flag terrorists. And there's one last section that I'll read, unless you have a comment, Greg.
Go for it. Go for it.
Okay, what is the United Jewish Appeal? The United Jewish Appeal, UJA, is the common denominator of all the key players of 9/11. The key 9/11 culprits that I have already shown are linked to the UJA, including Larry Silverstein, Frank Lowy, Louis Eisenberg, Rupert Murdoch, and Sam Miller of Cleveland. These are key players in the events of 9/11. Is there a connection? What is the UJA? The standard description of the UJA from news clippings describes it as the fundraising arm of the American Jewish Committee and the Anti-Defamation League of the B'nai B'rith, ADL. The ADL is the militant wing of the Jewish secret Masonic Society, the International Order of the B'nai B'rith, LOBB, which now does business as B'nai B'rith International. The ADL is apparently involved in the attack by undercover police at my home in August 2006. Furthermore, Olmer is a former partner of the Israeli criminals, e.g. Menachem Atzmon of ICTS, who ran, quote, security, unquote, and passenger screening operations at all international U.S. airports on 9/11. So I think that's a key thing to consider here in terms of how central UJA is in relationship to the event that set this entire, it's supposed to be 100-year foreign policy and global war that, of course, has domestic political considerations. And the only difference, I guess, between certain neocons who call, or certain people in the Pentagon who call it the long war, or the 100-year war, is that Bolton actually just says that it'll last 40 years. So I guess we only have a quarter century left in Bolton's.
Great. Isn't that wonderful?
Yeah.
So I guess from here we will. I know we mentioned at the top of the show JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, and I also mentioned the Center for Security Policy, which is run by Frank Gaffney, and it appears that that John Bolton has played important role in both of these think tanks over the years. And in addition, there's a lot of overlap between these institutions, these think tanks, with the Gatestone Institute, of which John Bolton, I believe is chairman. He's a top position at the Gatestone Institute as far as actual policy figures go. I don't know if he still holds that position now. He's national security advisor. I would imagine that he probably won't once he becomes national security advisor. That would be a serious conflict of interest. But there's a lot of overlap between these organizations. And you mentioned the article by John Swin. By the way, shout out to John over in the UK, who's doing a lot of tremendous work. The world needs this man. That's the name of his blog. And he wrote a great article about the overlap of these deep neoconservative, I guess, foreign policy hawks within the alternative media, and he connected a lot of dots between Rosenwald and the Gatestone Institute and Frank Gaffney, going all the way back to the days of Henry Scoop Jackson, which is where most of today's neocons really, they really got their start in terms of the shift from, in a lot of cases, of the the Kristol crowd, going from the Poderitz crowd, going from, I guess, Trotskyite Bolshevism to neoconservatism, all in the name of a more muscular, hawkish foreign policy than the liberal, I guess, foreign policy establishment at the time was advocating for. And this article by John Swin, we're going to link to it, obviously, with a lot of these other links that we were talking about in the show description, goes into a lot of details, linking a lot of these figures together, go from people like Frank Gaffney and Nina Rosenwald and the Gatestone Institute, to even people like James O'Keefe, whose Project Veritas has received funding from the Gatestone Institute. So that's one great article that we found that we've been looking at, that we're going to definitely share in our description. And there are two more. One was an article that Philip Weiss wrote for Mondo Weiss, linking together John Bolton's policies with Sheldon Adelson's policies. I think that's another very very instructive article over at Mondo Weiss, and in there it mentioned things like Bolton advocating for parts of Palestine, what we know as Palestine, to be given to Jordan and Egypt, which is something that Steve Bannon had said, was quoted as saying in Richard Wolff, or Michael Wolff's book Fire and Fury, at the time when he was talking about how Adelson and Netanyahu were all in on this, moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. That's another article. And then the third one, which I think we're going to break down a little more in depth, is this article from The Nation back in 2002, which centered, or prior to the Iraq War, which centered around JINSA and Center for Security Policy as being two of the leadish hawkish groups putting out propaganda prior to the Iraq War. This article was written in the summer of 2002. I think this is even before where really the Bush administration really publicly started to turn up the propaganda campaign, which I think would have been the fall of 2002. This article is written in the late summer of 2002, and it's getting into these two specific think tanks, particular think tanks, as helping to lead the way in terms of propaganda for a military attack on Iraq in the summer of 2002. So, Jeremy, if you want to talk about that article some more.
Well, I do. I want to go back to the. I just want to read a piece of the "World Needs This Man" article
Sure.
first, if that's cool.
Yeah,
And
go for it.
and before that, I went to jinsa.org, and it turns out that the chairman of the board of advisors and the chairman of the board of directors is one David P. Steinman. And I'll just read the first two paragraphs of his biography. David Steinman has been the advisory executive for the William Rosenwald Family Organization, which is located in New York City. That organization has overseen the business and financial interests of the Rosenwald family. He was with the Rosenwald organization for more than 30 years, since 1976. Previously, Mr. Steinman was a founding partner of the law firm of Furziger, Wohl, Finkelstein, and Steinman, with a broad corporate and commercial practice, including financial institutions. Prior to that, Mr. Steinman was with the law firm of Christie, Frey, and Christie, located at Rockefeller Center in New York City. From 1967 to 1970, Mr. Steinman was an assistant U.S. attorney for the Eastern District of New York and deputy chief of the criminal division of that office. And then it goes into all these different boards that he's on. So there you go. The Rosenwald Jinsa connection is as high as it goes. And yes, although there are certain subtle differences in terms of some of these neoconservative angles, I think what Abram Shulsky, who was the director of the Office of Special Plans in its brief but very devastating and, dare I say, criminal lifespan, he insisted that, quote, truth is not the goal, unquote, of intelligence operations, but, quote, victory, unquote. And so that's where I think that all of these neoconservatives agree upon.
Hmm.
I imagine Bolton is not necessarily harnessed to the truth, but to their idea of victory. And one other interesting character on one of the boards of JINSA was one General Richard Natonsky of the U.S. Marine Corps, who was in place at some key moments in Iraq when there was apparent involvement of Israeli snipers who were instigating a Gladio type of chaos operation and apparently taking deadly shots at U.S. Marine Corps in the mix in order to drive the chaos. And Natonsky was in high-level command structure during that time. So back to this World Needs This Man, the deep neocon connections to pro-Trump. Nina Rosenwald, remember the name. If we take a look into the history of Rosenwald, we find her involvement in the begins of neoconservatism. Rosenwald is an ardent Zionist that has created a network dedicated to pushing a very pro-Jewish causes and pro-Israel agenda that includes all kinds of propaganda and disinformation. Rosenwald's wealth has fueled a rapidly emerging alliance between the pro-Israel mainstream and the Islamophobic fringe. This alliance serves to sanitize and legitimize anti-Muslim propaganda, incorporate it with the ideas of neoconservative foreign policy heavyweights intent on promoting the Zionist agenda by invoking the specter of a common, quote, Islamo-fascist, unquote, enemy. Rosenwald's first political involvement was backing the hawkish Democrat Henry Scoop Jackson, a political figure rarely mentioned these days. That in itself is a red flag in my eyes, especially when we look at all the anti-immigration rhetoric in the alternative media. Maybe it was because he was behind an amendment to the 1974 Trade Act called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment that allowed Jews from the Soviet bloc to immigrate to the United States. Rosenwald's political activism began in the 1970s in support of Senator Henry Scoop Jackson. That's a reference. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment was intended to help refugees, particularly minorities, specifically Jews, to emigrate from the Soviet bloc. Jackson and his assistant, Richard Pearl, also lobbied personally for some people who were affected by this law, such as Anatoly, now Natan Sharansky. I do wish to delve deeper into this whole political situation at a later date. I don't want to get off track. It's important to note Senator Jackson's assistant was Richard Pearl. They both had an aide named Frank Gaffney. The connection between these three and Nina Rosenwald is vital to understand. And then I'll just read these last paragraphs about Gaffney. Gaffney began his government career in the 1970s, working as an aide in the office of Democratic Senator Henry Jackson under Richard Pearl. From August 1983 until November 1987, Gaffney held the position of Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear Forces and Arms Control Policy in the Reagan administration, again serving under Pearl. Today, Frank Gaffney runs a think tank called the Center for Security Policy. Rosenwald is on the advisory board and a regular financier through her funding arm, the Abstraction Fund, that operates out of 666 3rd Avenue, New York, along with the big military-industrial complex corporations Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing. Please check out the Center for Security Policy schedule. Okay. So I think that's one last paragraph I just want to read real quickly. Gaffney is also heavily promoted by Breitbart News, a big player in the alt-right movement that was conceived in Israel. The founder, Andrew Breitbart, was raised Jewish. The CEO, Larry Soloff, is Jewish. The news organization is financed by secretive hedge fund billionaire Robert Mercer. Mercer heavily financed John Bolton's super PAC that supported Donald Trump's campaign.
Bolton was also early benefactor of Cambridge Analytica as well. So
that's true. So I don't know exactly where to take it right now. I sort of wanted to read a little bit of the part of the cover-up of September 11th. In terms of some of these extending of these networks of these Jewish organizations, but also the question of the chaos, the sown chaos in Iraq, because in many ways it's that issue that's front and center that is some of the differences that some people have apologized for aspects of how the Iraq war turned out and how the chaos that took place and the hundreds of thousands of deaths that resulted in the midst of all of that is sort of being marketed as just a mistake of not great management, not knowing what so-called we were going to unleash. But I think that's an important layer that's held in place by these deception matrices that all the neoconservatives agree with. And it's mainly marketed towards the sort of the liberals and the progressives, whereas the deep background of Zionist involvement in the Middle East has very much to do with using terrorism to sow chaos, to drive people and politics in very specific ways. And so I think that needs to be pointed out at this point with a key supporter and involved person. And of course, Bolton was also in key places in the State Department in the midst of when these sniper attacks were taking place against U.S. military in a very shady way. So he needs to be called out in terms of his involvement in all of this. And the background, of course, of Zionist forces in the Middle East is usually understood in terms of the Operation Susanna, that was then known as the Lavon Affair, done in 1953, I believe, or 54. And it's one of the few false flag attempted operations that has ever been admitted publicly by the Zionist state. And it was only a few years ago, when it was like last decade, that it was admitted. But it included using Jewish Zionist assets in place in Egypt to attack British and American cultural institutions, to then be blamed on Muslim Brotherhood and to try to split the U.S. from Egypt in many ways. And of course, some of what they were attacking were things like libraries. And that has a deep background also, is that actually in the years previous to that, there was these bombings in Jewish communities in Iraq. And the Iraqi Jewish community is one of the oldest and most established, or at least it was, before the ascent of of Israel. But there was these key bombings in place that were actually that was then key Zionist Jewish assets in place were then convicted in Egyptian courts. And of course, there's still some debate about whether it was just blamed on them. But the timing of it and the way that it was used to sort of further drive Jewish people in Iraq to Israel at a key time in its history is very suggestive. And again, one of the targets here and one of the sources for this being a Zionist plot to sow chaos and through terrorism in Iraq, by the way, was a high-level CIA historian of some, maybe even an analyst or officer of some sort, who basically showed that there was lots of evidence that even things like the U.S. Information Agency and another library, and a place where Jewish people were utilizing the informational resources, was specifically targeted. So this history is there. So I just bring all of that up for people to understand that this has a very deep background here in terms of the use of Zionist terrorism specifically to sow specific chaos specifically in Iraq. And so that background is there. And so I think we need to help explain that the whole chaos that was sown in Iraq may not have been the plan of certain elements of the U.S. military or government specifically, although there were those in place that were ultimately complicit in it. But it was very much the plan of things like the Oded Yinon plan and the clean break doctrine, which of course involved a lot of these key people, right? Pearl as the key figure here who headed that up. Fife involved Wormser and Bolton are connected, I believe, very closely. And that was the very first year of the ascent of Netanyahu. And a part of that did have, it suggested sowing discord and transcending the local enemy. So I just want to read one little paragraph off of an article that we will link for people to look into again, because it hasn't been talked about much. Israeli Mossad snipers killing U.S. troops in Iraq, creating chaos. Richard Wilson's, this is at politicalvelcraft.org. Richard Wilson's hypothesis, Israeli soldiers and or Mossad agents are killing our soldiers in Iraq in order to enrage American troops so that the slaughter continues. Proof, at the very beginning of this video clip, you see a rifle with a video camera attached to it. This weapon is made by the Rafael Company, an Israeli arms manufacturer that also makes IEDs. If you watch the video all the way through, it explains how this rifle works. CNN stated that the camera used to film these shootings was not a mounted rifle camera. But as you watch the video, you see that with each shot fired, the camera recoils. That would only happen if it were mounted on the rifle. Why is this significant? Because this kind of rifle camera is extremely sophisticated and not available to your average Iraqi insurgent. I mean, it's not exactly an easily obtainable Saturday night special. Something this sophisticated points to Mossad. Then one last thing. The chaos is fomented to take control of nation-state central banks for the Rothschild cartel is the name of this section. Israelis freely move among U.S. and U.K. troops in Iraq and have access to top-level U.S. intelligence. Until July 2003, the head of all U.S. forces in Iraq and Afghanistan was General Tommy Franks, a Zionist Jew. He is now on the board of directors for Bank of America. On November 7, 2006, another Zionist Jew became a principal liaison between Mossad and U.S. forces in Iraq, Major General Richard F. Natansky of the Marine Corps. His title is Deputy Commandant for Plans, Policies, and Operations. By the way, remember, he's on the board of JINSA now. Because of this access, the, quote, insurgents, unquote, i.e. Mossad agents, know exactly where U.S. vehicles will be and who will be inside them. This allows them to target for maximum false flag effect. For example, on July 23, 2005, a detachment of 19 female U.S. Marines was sent to Fallujah to check Iraqi women for bombs. An IED blew up their truck. 2 of the young American women were killed. 5 were critically wounded and 4 were captured. The bodies of the 4 captured women turned up later in a garbage dump with their throats cut. Americans were outraged. Islamic clerics insisted that only Israelis could be so cold-blooded. And who was in charge of U.S. forces in Fallujah at the time? None other than Major General Natansky, the Mossad liaison. Last piece here, then you can finish it up here, Greg. Americans are supposed to believe that ragtag, quote, insurgents, unquote, use IEDs powerful enough to kill 3 U.S. troops per day on average. An American soldier even set up a blog on how, quote, intel, unquote, is betraying and targeting U.S. troops. but sometimes Mossad bomb makers accidentally blow themselves up in Iraq. According to Richard Wilson, Israeli sniping and IEDs are false flag operations. He says that on March 28, 2005, Americans arrested 19 Mossad agents who fired twice on a U.S. Marine checkpoint. The Marines beat up the Mossad agents and tore off their Star of David necklaces.
Wow.
U.S. media incorrectly said the agents were Americans. The Mossad agents said they were employees of Zapata Engineering, which helps the CIA conduct interrogations and also manages U.S. ammo dumps in U.S. motor pools in Iraq. IEDs in Iraq are powerful enough to flip over a 70-ton tank. Some of the models shoot depleted uranium projectiles and are triggered by electronic devices surreptitiously planted on U.S. armored vehicles. Zapata Engineering, which employs Mossad agents, makes this exact kind of trigger and oversees some of the U.S. motor pools.
Wow. Uh, Jeremy, I'm very glad you've identified this information and brought it out because it's very critical to because one of the things that was used to justify the continuation of the Iraq War was that the Iraqis are killing, the Iraqis are taking out Americans and things of that nature, and that was derived to, I guess, create anger towards the Iraqis that they're killing our troops and that we're being killed over there. And of course, a big part of perhaps the Chris Kyle myth that lays into that whole narrative as well. So this is hugely important, and it's an Israeli continuation that there was very much, obviously, Israeli primary interest in not only starting the war and making sure there was an Iraq war to begin with, but in perpetuating it in order to, it seems, to achieve and certain policy goals. And so this is very, very important, and it shows once again the Israeli hand that really has no qualms about American life, about really any life, these entities that are behind these most extreme elements within the Zionist Israeli government and the Jewish state. And so I'm very glad you talked about that and disclosed this information, and we'll definitely link to all the information that you've sent about this particular incident, which has gone extremely underreported here. And we've got about 3 or 4 minutes left here, I think. So
two minutes, yeah.
Okay, I'll be quick here. I think though with the Nation article, I thought was very instructive, as was the World Needs This Man article. And Nation article kind of went into some of the policy differences where we've seen where some of these, whoever, the interest that John Bolton represents, along with someone like a Frank Gaffney out of that whole Rosenwald circle, there's a combination of hawkish, hardline, quote-unquote, American national security interests with a hardline, Likud-friendly, right-wing Zionist the policy with regards to Israel, as well as with its, neighboring quote-unquote enemies such as Iran. And the article was mentioning things such as even Paul Wolfowitz, of all people, was getting uncomfortable with the JINSA/Center for Security Policy emphasis on settlement building in Israel. And of course, that's a big part of the controversy surrounding the hawkish Zionism of the Trump administration. So we can, of course, go back into that whole split later on in the future with regards to something along those lines. But I guess to sum it up, I'll say that I can't say I know where foreign policy is headed under John Bolton's watch with the National Security Agency, or with the National Security Advisor, excuse me. But I think what we know is based on the people surrounding Bolton, based on his history and the history of the people surrounding him in creating and maintaining these myths and the lead to all these disastrous events such as the Iraq War and other foreign policy disasters. We know the history, and we can identify based on the history what is being represented here. And it's not going to be in the best interest of we the people, of anybody really, other than people in very high positions. And so I think that we don't have time to be, oh, well, maybe Bolton's not so bad, or misidentifying him in a certain way. I mean, we have to have real critical analysis and that's what we've tried to provide here, a realistic analysis of Bolton. We don't try to get into fear-mongering or whatnot. It's very realistic analysis, I think, here, because that's what's needed, because there's a lot of noise going all ways, even by well-meaning people, and I think that it's important to try as best we can to identify what a John Bolton and the forces behind him and around him represent and where it's going to lead to. But I can promise you it's not going to be good, so it's important that we definitely keep watching and very close eye on what happens under this under Bolton's
Yes.
leadership here.
We're well out of time, but I just want to leave people with this. I'm going to link this article about Fort Lee, New Jersey in 9/11 by Gordon Duff and Jeff Smith. And at the end, it says in the beginning, it says, the dead have lots of friends, not only those on 9/11, but those that followed in country after country, including the Iranian nuclear scientists you murdered and never put a shred of nuclear weapons program evidence on the table during the nuke talks. We are combing through all the residents at the time of the 3 Jammer buildings below and have already named the complex, quote, Israel on the Hudson, unquote. Give our regards to all the Jinsa folks. Yes, we know about that too. Gordon will fill you in below from Jim Dean. And so we'll link that. And so that's from patriotic U.S. Military and intelligence folks who know what the folks that Bolton, who are connected to, what they did on September 11th and beyond. So till next week, Antidote, we out.